Deep from the annals of YouTube comes another episode of Wednesday's Serial. Alrighty, I don't know what's going on with my hair. First off, that's just life, my life. I hope no one else is afflicted with anything like this. So, today I'm going to discuss Charles Soule's Daredevil. Yeah, I read this whole thing over a few days. What's interesting to me is Soule. Most people would say Garney is the primary artist because he's the penciler through most of at least the first chunk of this run, though other people go through. What's really interesting is as you look through Daredevil here, I gotta pop open one while we talk about it, but I'm gonna pop open issue 2 so it's more variety. And Garney does a great job and provides a great look. But what's more interesting to me is I don't normally pay as much attention to this, but Matt Milla is the colorist throughout this entire dang run. And he has this coloring look that, I mean, it's more muted in a lot of ways, but allows certain colors to pop at times. A lot of it's that black, white, red almost look here. And this character is supposed to be invisible or phasing out of invisible. Uses really sharp colors and in a way that allows certain things to pop. It's very interesting. It's highlighting, and I think works well for Daredevil because it's not a I don't know, it's not a standard aesthetic, but it kind of fits this idea of how Matt sees the world in a way. Not exactly, because the way they normally depict Matt showing the world is kind of that device I believe Frank Miller invented, but I could be very wrong there. But you also see it throughout Ninja Turtles in different ways, with the characters that are just like lines all the way down, which they evoke at certain parts here. The look and feel is great. What we get in this first arc is this idea of this newcomer, Ten Fingers, is roaming the streets, and this new character, Blind Spot, who's an illegal immigrant who's created an invisibility suit for himself that runs on like D-cell batteries or something crazy like that, is fighting it because his family is wrapped up with this guy and he wants to go make a difference. And this kid is supposed to be kind of the best. In a way, has a lot of characteristics of like pre-Miller Daredevil, but set in this modern Marvel universe. It's pretty interesting, and I think you get a sense of that better when we finally get, at this point, it's old man Steve Rogers, not Captain America, but we knew that wasn't going to last. But the talk here that Daredevil and him have about Blind Spot is kind of this new kid running in. And what's great, too, is like they make a point, too, where he doesn't call himself a sidekick, but a partner, sort of an idea, associate. It is pretty strong because it's someone new with different motivations, different skills being kind of honed up and brought through. And I think it's interesting to see this relationship between Steve Rogers and Daredevil that isn't played upon so much prior. I know they've had run-ins, but it's not the side of Marvel Daredevil normally runs through. I don't know. There's all these ideas going. This is coming out of the Wade run. They also flip Matt from defender to prosecutor because he was disbarred when everybody knew he was Daredevil, but when they put the memory of who is Daredevil back in the bottle, it's pretty easy for him to get his ability to practice law back. And what's interesting to me is Soule, as most people know, was a lawyer. He was actually a prosecutor, but he worked with illegal immigration law as well. And what he did there, I don't know necessarily. It doesn't seem like he had a long stint in it, but he came through and became a writer instead, it seems. I don't know. I don't believe he still practices at all. I can't imagine that. But carrying through, you'd expect him to have more focus on kind of the lawyer aspect and bring it up more. And in truth, There are aspects throughout this run that play on that in an interesting way, but really steers pretty far away from that, all things considered. So the second bit is dealing with this electric story, which is interesting because she believes that she had a kid and needs to protect them, and someone implanted that memory in her mind. It doesn't go well. And then we get more of this idea of Daredevil chasing the hand. We get a bit with Spider-Man, and there's a little bit of information here that's set up as this big legal point. And even though this is playing on the legal idea, like getting information for a case, it's a MacGuffin. There's no legalese really in that story. I believe it's supposed to be around here. We get a break from the main run, or it wasn't a break, but a mini series happens. Daredevil and the Punisher that plays on what they normally play on with Daredevil and Punisher. What if Daredevil went too far or whatever? And Punisher trying to murder someone, but it doesn't really sing because Daredevil's supposed to be taking someone to Texas to prosecute them, which they keep bringing up basically means this guy's gonna die anyways. So why the Punisher is so motivated to deal with this guy in particular, especially considering the amount of effort over these 4 issues that happens, I don't know. And I thought the ending was kind of weak because I was expecting some of the legal bit, because so much here is Matt fighting for the legal system to happen, and we don't get to see any of that. And so the ending felt kind of hollow here. And it also just felt like at the beginning, there's a gunshot getting ready to take out this criminal who's being escorted to an armored truck. And Matt's like going like, is it Bullseye? No. If it was it this person? No. Is it Typhoid Mary? No, because there's no fire. Oh, it has to be the Punisher. Like, there's just like this very set rogues gallery, and it couldn't just be anyone pissed at this guy for, like, I don't know, killing their family or something. Like, it was a weaker part of this overall run, but I know it's an aside. I think there's some good stuff in here, but it's not I don't know, it's not as strong as the main run. So dark art is when things take a change. We had a lot established with this villain 10 Fingers, this whole idea of the immigration bit coming in, and I think it was a really strong idea for a villain, because whereas he is a bad guy, he's doing some things that are marginally better for these immigrants, but taking advantage of them. And if you know anything about some of the things that happen to immigrants as they come into other countries, and especially including America, there's a lot of people taking advantage of them, but the immigrants don't really have a choice to deal with it, or that choice is better than their other choices. And so I thought it was this really effective parable, like told through a superhero story, and there's a lot to lean on there, and there's a lot of fertile ground to tell a lot of stories that would be uncomfortable, but give it enough of a guise and someone to punch at the end of the day to make it more palatable. And instead, in Dark Arts, we get the introduction of a new villain that isn't really pictured here, but Muse. Although there's a big point in when he's first introduced, but that's just the name he's calling himself now, but it ends up sticking. Where he's creating these murals out of all these victims' blood that he's essentially bleeding. We find out he's an Inhuman. We tie into the Inhumans a few times. This is during the era when Marvel's trying to push the Inhumans over X-Men, and I know Soule had some hand in writing some of that as well. So this case builds over time, and there's some different factors and some plays on like justice now that happens with the idea of the Inhumans being a kind of separate entity held within New York, and how does that legally break down, which is kind of an interesting idea, but since we're dealing with vigilantes, it doesn't really come to any major fruition anyways. Here's a picture of Muse again. It's a pretty dark, murder take, but it's not as dark as like that one miniseries that I read with the child abuse and whatnot. But it is, horror stuff, people on meat hooks. So I don't know. It's an interesting take and it's an interesting villain. I get how it's a compelling story and a way to amp things up. But I felt like the fact that this villain had to take out 10 fingers to up the ante didn't really add that much. It created a dynamic for Blind Spot for a moment. But I feel like the loss wasn't worth the amp there with a new villain that had some fruition. Even if Soule wasn't going to play with him, I think someone else could have, though. Based on what I've read so far, wouldn't have been Zdarsky. And also, in the process of this, spoilers, Blind Spot gets blinded, which puts Daredevil on kind of a emotional mission to make something right. It doesn't really. It makes sense when you're reading it, but when you pull back, I think it's kind of an odd push. We get an inevitable Daredevil and Bullseye deal, which ties into this running with the devil arc, which is just kind of another arc for the book, but I think they're trying to give this tagline to this being Daredevil, and then there was a Bullseye, Elektra, and Kingpin mini running all at the same time. I've only read the Bullseye mini along with this thus far, and that was just bad. This arc is interesting, playing with kind of the move between Soule's run, or from Wade's run to Soule's run, and what happened there, what happened with his lover of that book, and so much. And it's actually playing a lot of the continuity stuff that they were dodging around, and they build up to this. And it's kind of weird to get it here, but I do feel like starting here would have been kind of a weak point, wouldn't have been very interesting. I don't know, it's all right, but I also feel like this arc had to run 5 issues, and it didn't need to be 5 issues. It felt like there's some editorial play here that I didn't love. And then from here we kind of get this big play. Matt builds up with some other heroes at kind of like going for this big thing, but he needs to capture a villain instead of just dealing with them in a very particular way, because as a prosecutor he needs him to not have been interfered with by the heroes to such a degree, but he has like 8 of them come down on this guy. And what we find is that he's pushing for the ability to have superheroes testify in court and set a precedent for it. Now, it's an interesting idea, and it creates this legal idea, and this is the biggest legal play, and probably the biggest continuing legacy Soule have on Marvel, is this idea. And he cites other cases that happened Marvel prior, but what's weird is superheroes have testified prior, though he's very careful with the wording and saying that he's setting a precedent for it with a certain kind of case, whereas in the past when superheroes have testified, it's usually in odd moments in Marvel where things are very heightened. This is for more routine criminal. The idea is so that they don't have to just drop a guy off at the precinct and hope the best happens. This allows them to make sure that the system has some venue to take advantage of their work, which is interesting because they're vigilantes, but they seem to play on this idea that the heroes have a general understanding that the cops are willing to work with them. I don't know. That gets played with in Zdarsky's run as well. But inevitably, with all this talk of legal superhero stuff, we get a issue with Jen Walters, and there's a bit of hint that things are going differently for her. But he's playing this idea, but at this point, he's being challenged. He doesn't know that it's Fisk behind it at the time, though. With his limited Rolodex, you think he'd put it together. That there's this character in court called Legal, who's this guy who wears these like wraparound sunglasses that he's dealing with, and they're headed to the Supreme Court. Fisk is pushing Tombstone to be in the background to take care of Daredevil, or really Matt Murdock, should things go south. Again, nobody knows Matt Murdock is Daredevil again, which is weird. And ultimately we get this weird issue. This is the most legal eagle issue where we have this testimony at the Supreme Court, and it's drawn as like the Supreme Courts are like going and punching Mad and beating him up with legal. But then he like parries and surrounds while they're making the legal argument. It gets kind of goofy, and it's fun. It's interesting, but I was given what they're doing and all the build for this, I kind of wish they played it more straight, I guess. But it was fun. It was an interesting way to deliver it, so it wasn't just a lot of people standing. And I think that was ultimately what I saw with that, was a kind of a fear of doing too much of the legal in courtroom action in a comic, because it wouldn't necessarily be very visually dynamic, which I find fascinating because there's been endless amount of court cases on TV and whatnot, and it feels like there has to be some ideas to pull, some ways to do that. Because it's not just two people in a room talking. It's a very framed, organized conversation. There has to be some play with like layout and delivery, and maybe going a bit more text heavy to having a more visceral background image or something. It just felt like we were shying away from what the mediums could deliver, because it wouldn't be a punchy fight in a Marvel, which, as much as I love, and I'm being a Marvel zombie these past few years, definitely feels like a room for some indie to come and develop some visual language here. But right after this, we get something with Blind Spot calling, so Daredevil has to go. Daredevil gets locked up in a hole for a while. I'm trying to remember. I think they don't specifically say how much time it was. I think it's something like eventually weeks, though, because they don't want to be too specific, sliding time scale and all that. But eventually, we get to this whole thing. Blind Spot's mom has been taken by the demon and has made a deal with the demon to help her son, but her son rejects the deal. But through all this, they fight off the demon of the hand, and he has his eyes back, but he has these blue glowing evil eyes. Yeah. In between this, which this ends this half of the run, and in this arc, we actually, Matt Milla's coloring goes to a more standard comic book coloring, which I think is a huge letdown, because this book had this very strong look and feel to itself, and it gets lost here. And I think actually a few issues earlier in that legal bit I was talking about. A bummer, because it was something that identified this run from even other runs of Daredevil, and to just give up on it partway through without any meaning when they establish all this idea and they're playing with the past and this legal stuff, and now this darker edge again. It felt like there's more play to be had by bringing that back, at least. I don't know. We get an annual with him dealing with Echo. She saves him because there's this thing going on with Claw where he's blasting out people's eardrums and whatnot and killing people, and this is really more of an Echo issue than a Daredevil issue, which is fine. It takes what would have been a couple issues or whatever, compacts into an annual, gets it done. Not the strongest of this whole run, but it's a good addition, good for an annual. And then we restart at 595 with Mayor Fisk, because he got elected. And pretty quickly we find Fisk brings Mad into the fold as deputy mayor. They point out 3 times that it's not like a vice president. If Fisk gets taken out, it's not like Matt becomes the mayor or anything. We have a lot of build with Daredevil on the run because Kingpin's making all vigilantes, though eventually not Spider-Man, the enemy. And I know the Spider-Man thing is because I always forget his name now. The guy who did the Amazing Spider-Man run that I hate wanted that to be an aspect of his run, and they never... I know there's an arc that had some resolution. They never really did anything with it. Another let down in that what would have been a 100 issue run. But anyways, Muse gets inspired on the TV and starts doing these homages to heroes, which is a really interesting play. You have this character that we've learned to despise, but he's creating art that we appreciate through the narrative, and it's this weird conflict between the art and the artist. And that's a hell of a thing to be having in a comic book, especially in relatively modern times. There's some deeper commentary that could have been had there, but just having that idea in the middle of this mainstream comic was great. We build up, and then we build up to 600. Yay! Where ultimately the thing that they said was going to happen 3 times, they write a rule in that the previous mayor, which I think was Jameson, had it said that the deputy mayor would become the mayor if anything happened. They never say Jameson, but like I feel like that's what it was, or maybe he was governor. That was Slot's run. That was forever ago. My memory ain't that strong for that. So Matt's the mayor, but he's knocked out as Daredevil. There's some tension, and then the city is under siege by the Hand because Blindspot made them mad. But he made them mad because while they were dealing with everything with Fisk, Blindspot was fighting Muse again, and Muse almost takes him out. And then Blindspot calls on the power of the demon from the Hand to take him out, but he doesn't want to kill him. Anyways, the Hand comes. So there's evil demon ninjas all over the city, and so they're dealing with that kerfuffle for a while. I don't know. They have this callback to The Dark Knight for some reason. I assume it's just The Dark Knight, but I mean, it's really just Daredevil on a horse. I don't know. And then we end, after all that with the art and everything, we end with Soule and Noto for a weird kind of like outro. So Noto's art is stuff I usually really appreciate. He has this very like great detail for faces and this kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say pastel, but it's kind of a bit more of a washed look that lets the backgrounds be there and create presence without too much detail. It's really great for a number of superhero comics, but going from what we had to Noto is a really harsh flip and feels like a complete tonal shift for the book. I don't think Noto was the best choice here. And I say that saying he's a great artist. He does a lot of great work for superhero comics, but I mean, from here to there and Daredevil in general, this guy just didn't feel right. He does a good job with what he has within his styles, so I mean, it's not like it's bad by any means. It's weird, especially to wrap this thing out. So we have a lot of setup, and now we're setting up one more idea. Daredevil goes and gets suckered into this thing. Hammerhead looks like he's just robbing a bank, but they have this big thing like, if you really just want money, you could just use a laptop anymore. Why risk it? Why do this? Why do that? But Hammerhead's in it for the attention, and then we see the minute that Daredevil's in it, Hammerhead takes all these gawkers that are on their cell phones and makes them hostages. And so Daredevil's dealing with that, and it's a pretty tense situation that is putting people... It brings a lot of media attention to Daredevil overall, is kind of the point, with this whole hero bid instituted by the mayor where they need to come down. And so there's some debate about that online, playing with some of the social media consciousness. I don't think there's a lot of commentary there. It's more just using that as a plot point. Interesting. And then through this, because Matt in the background has assembled some characters to take care of Fisk, notably like right here, like right before the new dawn of X-Men was coming, there's Cypher and this other character called Reader and this Inhuman from the past that helped him investigate. That's kind of a character B character for this run, one of the Inhumans. But this reader character is blind as well and can like make things into reality by reading them in Braille. And they've been going through a lot of Matt Murdock's history because it's so intertwined with Kingpins and they're trying to take him down, that they get on this thing of Matt Murdock's brother, which was a gaffe from old, sillier Daredevil, but Reader reads him into existence. And this guy is a scumbag, but it's a really fun intro. This feels like what's supposed to be a lighter story before we have our ultimate climax. But it's pretty interesting, and despite Mike Murdock running around causing problems, at the end, the idea is to have him be unread by Reader, essentially, so he disappears. But then Matt stops him and says, no, I want to choose family, and wants to let him live, which is interesting and weird, but he also says, I hope I don't regret it. And then we have... Oh, nanny. The Death of Daredevil, which... So at the start of this, Matt gets hit by a truck all the way he got his powers while he's saving someone, while he's gearing up for everything. And then we get into this whole sequence of what would be a good way to wrap up the arc, more or less. You know, he finds a way to use his temporary marital powers to stop the Kingpin. He has all this and he puts the Kingpin in position, but it's kind of not too far. It's really putting the toys back in the bin as you found it for the next writer. And there's some emotional resolution with a couple of the other characters. He takes out most of his rogues gallery in this one big fight where there's like Electro, Ikarai from Wade's Run, Bullseye, Typhoid Mary, and I believe a couple others that I don't know all the Daredevil villains so well. But it's like a huge rogue gallery fight, and he basically uses Electro with one big hit to like take out a number of them. And Claw's there, and the Claw freaking out with the sound like takes out two of them right away, and by the time he's done he just has to kind of like bop a couple more and they're dealt with because he plays them off each other, which is, I don't know, it's a little too perfect, a little too clean, and it's very clear we're kind of in this weird dream sequence. And when we end, we get this idea that Matt's just been stuck in a hospital bed all this time, dreaming of all this stuff ending the way it should, and then he has this emotional resolution with Blind Spot, and it's a weird place to end the run because it's very much leaving Matt Murdock and Daredevil in this really precarious state, which is something that's happened between a number of the writers of Daredevil, essentially since Bendis, I believe, had the book, where there's kind of this handshake where like, I'm going to end my run with Daredevil with him in this precarious situation. You have to write him out of that paper bag, and then you do what you're going to do with the character. And it seemed like Soule was trying to do what you normally do with the superhero book and put it back in the bag. I just feel like there's some editorial interference here where they had Zdarsky, who at this point is, I think they believe, supposed to be a name, because this is post Spider-Man life story. I guess Zdarsky, like, this is how it feels to me. I don't know this, but this is how it feels to me. Zdarsky liked the idea that Mao was hit by a truck and kind of needs to build himself back up. I like that whole idea. And Marvel wanted to give that for him, but Soule had this whole ending already written and planned and probably had long before he was in the middle of writing these comics, so he had to find a kind of rejoiner to end the book and not move it forward necessarily. And so he found this kind of idea of like, well, he's hit by the truck, we tell our ending, but we leave that as a dream sequence because life doesn't work like that. And in the end, sometimes terrible things to those who try the hardest, and it's for naught. And there's something kind of powerful there, but as far as storytelling goes, it's such a limp ending. But it's hard to not recognize that he wrote the good ending and then had to sacrifice some pages of that to feed into this other idea. Yeah. So overall, I think this run's really great. I think the ending's a bit of a wet noodle, but the idea of its sound, it's not the worst ending in comics by any means whatsoever. I overall think this is a really strong Daredevil run. I really enjoyed it. And then I want to talk about a kind of couple enders here, and then we'll be prepped so I can talk about the Zdarsky run, which, let me tell you, that first arc did not win me over, but that's not going to be a discussion for today. Okay, so there's another annual on this run. Schultz and Takara? Some other people doing this annual. And I'm not pronouncing anything right. But this is Misty Knight having a problem with Daredevil because she's a cop and her partner's a cop and Daredevil's against the law and all that, which doesn't make sense for Misty Knight, like, at all. It makes sense for kind of the Misty Knight that's been put forward in the Netflix stuff, but not here. It's doubly weird because the last time Daredevil and Misty Knight interacted, they banged. That was the Dark Knights series mini, whatever that you call that one, because never seen that presentation before. It might have a technically different name. But here it's like they've never interacted before, when they definitely interacted before. Like, they're in the same corner of Marvel. It's just this super weird book. Like, it's almost like an okay story because they're worried about like how a kid perceives heroes and justice, and they're talking about the ideal of it. But it's a Marvel comic, and I can't get past the fact that this is Misty Knight and Daredevil in 2021, 2020, not knowing who the other is. It just doesn't work. And what kills me is if they had replaced Misty Knight with just a cop you never dang heard of before, it works. Could still be a black woman, great, whatever. It just has to be someone we haven't met before, and it works. So it's literally a case where you just slap a name on a character and your story works, instead of trying to bring in someone where they have a shared history, and not like a trivial like background one issue in the 70s they met once kind of. Really, no, like Misty Knight and Daredevil are run in the same circles. It is insane to say that they haven't interacted before. It doesn't work with any greater understanding of either character. So, bugaloo, boo-boo. So I was thinking of saving this for a separate video, but it just doesn't make sense. It is too related to Soule's run, and it does dovetail right into Zdarsky's, but Zdarsky rejects half of what happens in this mini, so here we go. The Man Without Fear. Stanley died, so this doesn't get to be a good cover. I understand why they did what they did, and more than anyone else that they give this memorial stuff to, Stanley, of course. But I have to admit, when they did Chadwick Boseman a little while later, I'm like, the dude acted in one movie. What? No, he doesn't get maybe a page in the back somewhere, sure, but this was Stan Lee, yes. Steve Ditko, sure. You know, if they did it for when Jack Kirby, like, totally, you know, like any of the creators of Marvel Comics who laid down that legacy, yes. The actors are not that important. But this starts right where the run left off. I mean, Daredevil is in the hospital. We're seeing him wake up as Foggy's there dutifully, regularly, and actually dodging visiting hours to spend more time with Matt, kind of talking through some stuff. The first issue is a little like I would have put this down after the first issue if I was buying it when it was coming out. Like it's just kind of like a you remember Daredevil? Yes. I feel like this kind of comic back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, even sometimes the 90s made a sense. The access we had to older comics was so much less. Once we get to the 2000s, there's so many reprints and other things that it's a lot easier, even if it is somewhat expensive. And then once you get to the 2010s, there's a legal means, of course, but I mean, very quickly, Comixology comes in relatively affordable, and then the subscription service comes in, and like now, and more importantly than that, and even to the decade before, like Wikipedia, understanding the general story of these characters, brief synopses of what had happened in the past, stuff like this is feels dated at this point. But pretty quickly we move forward, and the pain of it all. We see Matt broken. We see Matt afraid, man without fear. And a lot of this is the kind of Defenders cast coming and working with Matt, trying to get him to move forward. As he's struggling to walk, he's struggling to move, and there's so much talk about like if it was just the truck you'd be able to bounce back, we could do all this, but it's all the hits over the years. And they even make a point in this issue where the doctor says like I haven't seen someone worked over ever so hard, not even veteran boxers, playing off the idea that I think it's a really smart idea, but they for all their build of Daredevil, they don't actually go back to something like Daredevil Yellow or the first Man Without Fear mini and talk about how Matt's dad did not want a life of violence or for him to be relying on his fists. He wanted him to be smart. He wanted to be ahead. He wanted him to be a lawyer because he wanted him to be doing something meaningful, but also to be relatively safe himself. For some mixed reasons, but I mean, ultimately, that's what he wanted from Matt, which is not a bad thing. There's some talk in some of them where like he's worried about his boy being weak because he's blind, and you know, there's some of that. And I mean, is that so wrong either? I don't think so, but I mean, there is kind of a mixed emotion there, right? And playing off that, and ultimately, here we are at kind of this point in the road, and it's Daredevil. I mean, he's taken hit after hit after hit, and I like this idea of this pain and excrusion of it, and this kind of weight of all the years of doing this kind of thing having a toll, having a cost. I think it gives these characters, you could say grounding, but I think it gives some gravitas and weight to the legacy of these characters. Not that we're going to see Daredevil ultimately retire. Ultimately, this isn't going to make anything. But I mean, in this story, there's kind of a realization of it, I guess. And I think it's really strong. But I mean, what's also somewhat remarkable about this mini is they have a little bit with some like old outings that the other characters had with Daredevil, talking about like this Matt that was the Man Without Fear. In particular, one story of like some guy like holding a gun basically right to his head and him not flinching and like stepping forward, doing that kind of thing, but putting kind of the weight on doing that kind of thing, not like an action movie play, but like that's crazy, but it worked. He's fearless. Like it doesn't make sense. And putting that idea, the Man Without Fear, and putting the weight on it by viewing it through others' eyes who are capable people, but wouldn't necessarily have the stones to do that, except for, I mean, like, they point out like, Luke, yeah, I've done that, but that's not the same thing, you know. I don't know. It really hit so much what I think makes Daredevil a compelling character to so many people. But really, this thing sticks in the hospital most of the time. It's 5 issues of pain and misery, and I mean they fit the suit in here and there, but I mean it's a compelling read for what should be a droll idea, which again I think is some of the magic of comics coming forward, a la kind of that lawsuit part I pointed out. But I mean they play it straight. I don't know. McKay here and his army of artists throughout this really strikes something pretty impressive. And McKay was given, this seems to me like one of the hardest assignments in comics. You're sandwiched between these two runs. You don't know what's coming really. You have this weird ending, and you're set here, and you're supposed to make something of essentially an inch being gained. And so McKay made it like every fight, like a step back, a step forward, but that fight for ultimately that final inch. But part of it is admitting that Matt now has fear. It's, I don't know, it's a real step for the character. It's character development, but not character growth. I don't know, and then we step to the future. Keep reading, kids.